Welcome to World of Trouble with me, Sam Kiley. My guest today is Sir Bill Browder, once an American investor, indeed the biggest investor in Russia. He fell foul of the Putin regime, and the consequences of that were many and manifold, but most tragically resulted in the death of his lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky.
Tell us what Putin did to you and then did to him.
Sure. So I was the largest foreign investor in Russia for the decade between 1995 and 2005. I had an investment fund called the Hermitage Fund. And what I discovered in the investment world was that all the companies that I was invested in were being robbed blind by these people known as the Russian oligarchs. And I started to expose the corruption, researching how they did it, who got the money, then working with the FT and the Wall Street Journal and other publications to expose it. And as you can imagine, that didn't make me very popular inside of Russia. And I was expelled from the country in 2005. I was declared a threat to national security. My office in Moscow was raided in 2007, and they seized a bunch of documents. And then those documents that they seized were used in a very complex fraud in which a bunch of government officials and organized criminals working together stole $230 million of taxes that my firm had paid to the Russian government. In order to discover this fraud, I hired a young lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky. He discovered the fraud. He exposed it. He testified against the officials involved. And then he was subsequently arrested by the same people he exposed. They put him in pretrial detention. They tortured him for 358 days. And they ultimately murdered him in Russian police custody on November 16th, 2009, at the age of 37. And his murder has led to a 17-year campaign for justice, which has resulted in something called the Magnitsky Act, named after Sergei Magnitsky, which freezes the assets and bans the visas of kleptocrats and human rights violators, and also specifically the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky. The Magnitsky Act now exists in the United States, in the UK, in Canada, EU, Australia, in total 35 countries. And it's the basis for which many of the sanctions that were put on Ukraine were put on Ukraine. There was never any debate or argument after the start of the full-scale invasion. It was almost immediate that all allied countries would freeze the assets of oligarchs and Russian officials. And so the Magnitsky Act has, of course, grown far beyond the Magnitsky case. It's being used in this terrible war of aggression. It's also being used against human rights violators in other countries, in China and Nicaragua and Iran and so on and so forth. And so, as you can imagine, Putin didn't take too kindly to this Magnitsky Act, and he's been chasing me around the world with death threats, kidnapping threats, Interpol arrest warrants, and all sorts of other nastiness. He was amazed and surprised that, one person could cause him so much trouble, but that is exactly what I've done. Now, of course, I'm not satisfied with the Magnitsky Act being the punishment. I'd like to see in a non-Putin regimes in the future that people who killed Sergei Magnitsky go to jail for torture and murder, not just having their assets frozen. But in the meantime, that's at least something to celebrate.
But here in the UK, Bill, we know of Litvinenko and many, many others, the Skripals, that if you fall foul of Putin's regime, he can bring the full power of the state, sometimes in a very kind of deliberate and spectacular way with the use of the sort of chemical or biological weapons or chemical weapons that the Skripals were attacked with that could only have come from a state, sending signals. I mean, frankly, how come you're still alive?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it's I I think that they would love to have me not being alive. They've certainly done a lot of things and failed at a lot of things, which might have resulted in my demise. First and foremost, I didn't take the advice of 99.9% of my friends and colleagues and advisors, which was to just after Sergei's murder to go to ground, to shut up, to be quiet, to not do anything about it. I did the opposite. I went hugely public, very actively naming everybody involved, constantly exposing their crimes. And that put them a little bit on the back foot, on the defensive, because everybody else does just the opposite. Much easier to kill someone that nobody knows about, that nobody knows what the story is. And so it became a much bigger deal for them than just quietly slipping some Novichok on my door handle and watching me squirm as I died. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the ultimate objective for Putin after the passage of the Magnitsky Act was to try to discredit the Magnitsky Act so it could be repealed. And so in their perfect world, what they really wanted to do was get me back into Russia in prison so that they could torture me just like they did Sergei. So after a week or a month of torture, I would go onto television and recant everything that I said they did in the hopes that they could then, on the back of that, repeal the Magnitsky Act and then kill me. That would be their perfect scenario. And so they've been chasing me around the world, trying to get me back to Russia in really very deliberate ways. And so, for example, as I mentioned before, they've tried to use Interpol 8 times using the Interpol notice system, red notice system, which is the international arrest warrant system issued through Interpol, to have me arrested. And I've been arrested several times, once in Madrid, once in Geneva. And so their whole plan was to get me back to Russia and do all this terrible stuff to me. And the arrest warrants never worked. And they've been chasing me in all sorts of different ways. They've applied to the British government using what they call mutual legal assistance to have me extradited back to Russia. They've sued me. They made movies about me. They've done everything possible. They've hired smear campaigners to try to discredit me in the West, major, highly financed campaigns, hoping that if I was discredited, then the West wouldn't protect me, and then they would send me back to Russia for all this terrible stuff. And what I would say about the Putin regime is that they're very evil, but they're not that great at exercising their evil. And the reason they're not so great at it is they have what I would call C students from D universities with no real motivation to do what they're supposed to be doing. And so they mess up on almost every one of their projects. And by the way, it wasn't so different with Litvinenko. There was a whole trail of polonium going all over Russia. I think they made 3 tries before they killed him because it was such an incompetent operation. And of course, they never got the Skripals. They ended up getting Dawn Sturgis, a poor woman living in Salisbury. And so they're not that good at the stuff that they do. And we can see how bad they are at the stuff that they do with their execution of their war in Ukraine. It's been a disaster. They are supposedly number 2 military in the world. Is not 2 military in the world. It's actually the number 2 military in Ukraine after Ukraine. And so they're just not that good at the stuff. Now that doesn't mean that one day you're gonna not, you could easily read some horrific story about what happened to me because their intentions are still there and their intentions are still bad and they still have a lot of resources. But there's this expression, I've got to be lucky every day. They've only got to be lucky once. And so far they haven't been lucky once, but they could be. And so it's a very real issue. It's a very real fear, and it's something that I have to think about a lot.
I mean, this is a regime that's not above going after people's family members in order to get to them, or indeed to punish you. They could go after your children and others very close to you. I mean, how is that something that you square within the family? I mean, does that cause stress and strain between you?
Well, that's very interesting because you mentioned children, and I have a 17-year-old son who was inspired by the work that I did, and he got involved in a big project to research how the Russians were using cryptocurrency to launder money. My generation doesn't understand cryptocurrency. His generation does. And he discovered all sorts of schemes and scams and bypassing sanctions operations that they have. He wrote a 100-page report. He presented it in Parliament. He convinced 26 members of parliament to write to the foreign secretary to close down some of the scams. They closed down some of the scams with new sanctions. And then on June 2nd, this summer, he was sanctioned by the Russian government. So he's the youngest person ever sanctioned. So they do go after people, but my family is going after them as well. So, I mean, it's not a pleasant thing. I do worry about everybody in my family. I'm sure that everyone worries about their family members.
Well, most people don't have a kind of target on their head, courtesy of one v. Putin.
Yeah, that's true. And, we do what we have to do, and we take whatever precautions we can take. But I also don't want my children to live in a bunker anywhere like Vladimir Putin, who's such a paranoid guy sitting down in his bunker. We're not going to live in a bunker.
Have you, through this process, did you run into, and this I'm slightly got an axe to grind myself, because as a journalist in a lot of these places, I'm told, particularly by British Foreign Office officials, oh, don't get into trouble, there'll be nothing we can do for you. A kind of reluctance from the establishment to really get onto the front foot over the issues that you were raising, not least because London itself historically has enjoyed, shall we say, healthy capital flow from people of unhealthy ethical backgrounds.
Well, I think you're being way too polite.
How would you put it?
I think that there was a whole class of people who were, feeding at the trough of dirty Russian money. I think that London was the center of Russian money laundering and Russian capital flight. And a lot of very important people in the British establishment, in the House of Lords, former government officials, were basically concierges, financial concierges for the Russian oligarchs and for the Putin regime, taking a lot of money, and what they viewed as a lot of money, what the oligarchs sort of laughed at. This is like the kind of
Chump change
that's sort of, on the floor of their car, flicking at these greedy little members of the establishment in the UK who were thinking that this was big money, and they were sacrificing the integrity of the United Kingdom. And when I say it's sacrificing the integrity of the United Kingdom, what I mean is that you have these individuals who were members of the establishment that were whispering in the ears of successive prime ministers and foreign secretaries saying, no, we shouldn't crack down on these people. It would cause us trouble. We have so much to lose. Let's not do it. And just to remind everybody, one of our prime ministers, Theresa May, she was the Home Secretary at the time that the Litvinenko widow wanted to have an inquest into why did her husband die, who killed him, who's responsible. And she wrote a letter to the court saying there should not be an open inquest into the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, because that would upset diplomatic and business relations with Russia. So she was saying we shouldn't investigate a murder using radioactive materials in the UK because we wouldn't want to upset business. That's on paper. You can look up the document. It's there. And that was just one of the documents that's in the public domain. She had to put it into court. But all the other decisions were being made very much, on the hush-hush, on the down low, where the British government, successive British governments, wanted nothing to do with upsetting Putin and upsetting the oligarchs. And so I could barely get a meeting inside the Foreign Office for many years. It was remarkable. I mean, they would not even let me into the building because I was so radioactive, because nobody wanted to mess around with the gravy train, the feeding at the trough.
Have things improved? I mean, we now at least do have a version of the Magnitsky Act in the UK with much more targeted sanctions. Or is there still this sort of schism between, if you like, the ethical track and the financial track and the establishment? I mean, are you still facing obstruction from people trying to do all kinds of deals in Russia or with Russia or around Russia?
Not at all. And so the moment that the full-scale invasion started, all of these individuals realized how completely irresponsible it was to do that. And anybody who was in power understood that they would lose power very quickly if they were to do anything that was seen to be sympathetic to Putin. And, as you introduced me, I have a sir in front of my name. I was knighted. The same foreign office that wouldn't give me a meeting in 2015 or 16 recommended me for a knighthood in 2024. So, it's completely 100% changed from one to the other. Now the British government is probably the most robust government in the world when it comes to holding Putin to account, standing up on behalf of Ukraine. I mean, it's truly remarkable how much the country has changed, but it only changed when too late. The full-scale invasion. If we had been tougher, if other countries had been tougher on Putin after he went in and took Crimea, if we had imposed devastating sanctions, he might not have done the full-scale invasion. He thought he could get away with it. He thought we were all so weak and cowardly that he could roll in there and the Ukrainians wouldn't put up a fight and we wouldn't help the Ukrainians, and that would be the end of the story. And there's this expression about sanctions, which is that they serve two purposes. They can either serve as a way of preventing people from doing bad stuff, if you use them properly, a deterrent, or they can be used as a punishment. And the problem is that we didn't use them as a deterrent, and so now we have to use them as a punishment. But when you punish people, you've got to punish them 100 times harder than you have to deter them. And so even though the British government is exactly where it should be, and I should say every prime minister, Labour, Conservative, every prime minister now has been exactly where they should be when it comes to Ukraine, it's kind of too late in the sense that there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dead Ukrainians that didn't have to be dead if we had been more robust, if we hadn't been concierges to the Russian oligarchs.
I mean, that I couldn't agree with you more, frankly. I mean, I was in Ukraine in 2014, 2015, the Crimea seizure, then the so-called uprising in the Donbass, clearly, obviously driven entirely out of Moscow. And between then and the very early 2020s, Ukraine was actually forbidden. The United Kingdom, for example, refused to provide any kind of lethal aid to a country, a democracy that had been invaded by an autocracy next door. And the trajectory of the change in heart, I have to say, I mean, you've been very straightforward about the attitude of the Foreign Office and the British establishment, but they were fiercely against any kind of support for Ukraine until it became impossible not to. So it did look surely as a sort of bandwagoning and completely unprincipled.
Well, I mean, the unfortunate thing about the world is that most people are sheep. They're just running in one direction or the other, depending on there's not that many leaders. There's not that many hugely charismatic, moral, northern stars to look at out there. That's just the nature of humanity. That's the nature of society. America celebrates the great role it played in the Second World War. Well, they didn't want to get involved until Pearl Harbor. I mean, this happens time and time again. Everybody, they don't redesign a faulty aircraft until after it's crashed, and that's where we are right now. But the UK is doing what it should be doing as far as Ukraine is concerned. Ukraine is doing a pretty good job right now in fighting off the Russians. Wasn't always, but it is now. And with significant help from the UK. But of course, you're right. I mean, and everybody was doing the same thing. Nobody was supplying weapons until it was too late. But now we are, except for the Americans, of course. The Trump administration has cut off Ukraine. The Ukrainians are being very, very clever about developing drones that break through Russian air defense. And they've now done something which I don't think anyone could have ever imagined, which is that Russia is sort of indiscriminately attacking civilians in Ukraine through bombs and drones. And now Ukraine is retaliating by systematically dismantling the oil and gas industry of Russia by blowing them up. And I think this is extremely effective. And I think it may potentially, it was not going to lead to the end of the war, but it may lead to the end of the indiscriminate violence against Ukrainian civilians. I think that, right now, depending on whose numbers you believe, somewhere between 25 and 40% of Russian oil refining capacity has been destroyed, or at least impacted, so it doesn't work right now. And I imagine that if the Ukrainians could double that, they're really in a sort of perfect position to say to the Russians, it's real simple. Don't hit our civilians with stuff, and we won't destroy your oil refineries. And I think that's a pretty fair situation. And that if that were to happen, then the war then gets narrowed down to the front lines. And the front lines, we've seen that the Ukrainians have now created a kill zone. Basically, there's nobody who can cross the front line without dying because they use drones so effectively. And if that were the case, then I don't believe you're ever going to have Putin signing a peace treaty. He can't do that. I don't think the war is ever going to end officially. But I can imagine that it may grind down to a sort of low level, potentially even totally quiet front, in the same way as North and South Korea did. And that's kind of my prediction about how this thing finally resolves. It's not going to be with Putin signing a peace treaty. It's not going to be with Ukrainians giving up territory that the Russians haven't conquered. It's going to be sort of having the front lines eventually frozen. And it's not going to be because Donald Trump does anything or forces Ukraine to do anything, because he can't force Ukraine to do anything. And it's not going to be because Vladimir Putin is convinced of anything. It's going to be just because at the end of the day, it's a stalemate. And that's sort of how I would envisage this thing playing itself out.
Well, let me put you to a slightly different scenario, which is my theory, which is I think that actually the Ukrainians can win this. I think that the systematic attacks on the oil infrastructure are also indicative of, excuse me, they're also attacking the medium and long range logistics platforms, the Kerch Bridge. The Ukrainians have completely dominated the Black Sea for more than 3 years now. They actually have won the battle for the Black Sea without a navy. That they could, or could they not simply collapse the Russian army into a rout? And what would that mean for Putin?
That would be great if it were true. And I think part of the problem we have is that we're all so rooting for Ukraine that we chalk up every victory they have, and we kind of ignore the capabilities that Russia has. And what Russia has is a very large population, much, much bigger than Ukraine, much larger financial resources than Ukraine, a much deeper sort of reservoir of ammunition than Ukraine has. And as a result of that, I think that and as a result of Putin's character, I think you have to assume that he will, even let's say that all the soldiers in Crimea, surrender, which is sort of a possibility if all of their supply lines completely get cut and they can't get more weapons and so on. It doesn't mean that the Ukrainians can go into Crimea and retake it. It means because they don't have the physical resources to do that. They don't have enough soldiers to do that. What they're really good is at defending. They're not very good at attacking. And the reason they're not good at attacking is that when you attack, you incur much greater casualties than when you defend. And so I don't, as much as I'd like to think it's the case, I think that Putin is such a brutal man. He's got so much he's willing to throw at it. He's got absolutely no capacity for empathy or guilt or anything. He takes no responsibility for the loss of life of so many people that he'll just carry on. And so, I hope I'm wrong, but I know him from my own struggle pretty well. And I know that he never does what would be the rational thing to do. His entire modus operandi is to escalate no matter what. And if you humiliate him, he'll escalate even more. And of course, we saw that. The oil refineries were getting blown up, and then all of a sudden they're launching a massive missile and drone attack just directly into residential neighborhoods in Kiev. No military objectives whatsoever, just killing and terrorizing regular innocent civilians. That's Putin. That's how Putin operates, and I think that's how he's going to continue to operate. And so I think, in my own estimation, the best case scenario is stopping Putin where he is, not expecting him to negotiate, and just making it, forcing a peace deal, which isn't a deal, but just one where it's just so punishing to him that, it kind of by de facto, things just calm down. I hope I'm wrong. I hope you're right. I hope that Ukraine can win. It's certainly glorious what they've achieved, but don't underestimate the resources and brutality of Vladimir Putin.
If accepting that he has deep resources and almost unlimited brutality, and we've seen that in Irpin and Bucha in the Ukrainian case, we've seen it in Georgia, we've seen it in Syria with the barrel bombing of hospitals and so on. Time and again, we've seen this behavior from Putin and his regime. What is his appeal, therefore, to Donald Trump?
Well, I mean, I think Donald Trump has made himself pretty transparent in this whole thing. Donald Trump is a person who's running. He's got sort of two things going on at the same time. He's the head of state of the United States, and he's a profit maximizing businessman who's, according to various reports, has doubled his wealth while he sat in the White House. How has he doubled his wealth? Through different business deals, through the UAE, through Saudi Arabia, through cryptocurrencies, through Kazakhstan. And so it wouldn't be a leap to say that, in these secret meetings that he's had with Putin, there weren't various lucrative offers being made to him and the people around him to do more business in exchange for not supporting Ukraine, or perhaps in exchange for helping Putin get Ukraine. That seems to be what's going on. There's no better theory out there right now as to what's happening. It's not like this is some kind of scandalous theory I've come up with.
It's not a scandalous theory that you've come up with. Is it reinforced by the idea that he's also there's a sort of man crush in his behavior towards Putin? I mean, there is a sort of sense that he's meeting his hero.
Well, I wouldn't attribute too much sentimentality to Donald Trump. He's a very practical guy. He likes money. It's as simple as that. The Qataris gave him a gold-plated 747, and then later on, the Qataris were able to build an Air Force training base inside the United States, a sovereign Qatari Air Force base in the United States. The Emiratis gave him and Steve Witkoff $500 million for shares of a company that had just been started called World Liberty Financial. And then all of a sudden, the United States lifted restrictions on the sale of advanced microchips to the United Arab Emirates. Trump likes people with money that they're ready to share with him. And so why would it be any different with Russia? I don't think that, he's got any particular love or hate or anything with anybody in the world. I think he just looks for what's in his narrow financial and personal interest.
In terms of your work now, sort of where is your focus, and are you clearly making headway, perhaps, as a result of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, in terms of targeted sanctions against Russians involved with the war? But are you detecting a kind of cleaning up of the act elsewhere within the British system?
I think that's too much of that's too big a stretch. So the British system, Britain is set up to be sort of the international crossroads of the world. The lawyers, all sorts of people from bad countries all fight with each other in British courts about who's stealing from who. Britain is a place that if you come from a non-rule of law, non-property right country, you can buy a big house for your family and they'll be safe there. And as a result, there's a lot of dodgy people from a lot of places still circulating in London. It just so happens that the Russians are not welcome. But, if you're Kazakh or Azerbaijani, no questions asked. The dictator of Azerbaijan, according to many investigative journalists, owns a huge swathe of properties in central London. He's on a salary of 150 grand a year. They have something called the unexplained wealth order, which is a law which says that if somebody has unexplained wealth, then the law enforcement agencies can grab that. Have they used it against the dictator Aliyev of Azerbaijan? No. The Azerbaijani dictator continues to enjoy his property in central London. And so I think that Britain has a long way to go before it becomes a clean, transparent, non-corrupt place. But I'm glad to see that the Russians are no longer welcomed with open arms.
I mean, the picture you paint, I'm just thinking, because we were talking there about Trump being kind of mesmerized by money and motivated by money. And on both sides of the Atlantic, with a slightly different approach, you have the identical problem, which is this fetishization of great wealth. To what extent are you planning, or can you sort of undermine that and inject matters of principle? And of course, bearing in mind that you were a very, very wealthy man, and in your early part of your career was very successful at pursuing great wealth, using wrinkles in the Russian economy at the time.
Well, so it's a totally different story being a politician and using your political power to achieve wealth. That's called corruption. In some cases, it would be treasonous, depending on what powers and what decisions you make as a politician. Being a capitalist, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, if we don't have capitalists, then we're going to end up having communism. And communism is the worst thing ever, where everybody lives a terrible, low standard of living. And so I'm an absolute capitalist. I come from a family of communists. My grandfather was the general secretary of the American Communist Party, but I realized that was a failed political experiment. So capitalism is fine. Pursuing wealth is fine. It's pursuing wealth outside the rules, which is not fine. It's defrauding people is not fine. Stealing, killing people is not fine for money. And it's certainly not fine for government officials to act outside the national interest for money. Two very different things. And for what it's worth, in the UK, the government, I don't see, with the exception of one particular person I'm not going to name on this podcast, but I don't see a lot of politicians, taking bribes in the UK and doing terrible things. I think the UK is relatively clean as far as that's concerned. Doesn't mean that the policies are not sort of warped the way we've discussed them. But it's a totally different thing when you have a head of state who basically enriches himself or herself at the expense of the people in that country. And that's a very, very bad thing. And you wonder why Africa is so terrible. Africa is a total resource-rich region of the world with the poorest people ever in the world. Why is that happening? Because it's just corrupt from top to bottom. There's nothing that's not corrupt. Corruption leads to a lower standard of living. So you can't have corruption and you can't have communism, but if you can have well-regulated rule of law capitalism, that usually is what leads to the best outcomes for most people.
Well-regulated rule of law capitalism is not a phrase that probably made you very popular in many boardrooms in the West around the world, at least prior to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Well, it's interesting because when I went to Russia, I ran an investment fund. And my investment fund was I said to my clients, look how cheap everything is in Russia. Look how inexpensive, undervalued these oil companies are. And the reason that they're undervalued is because they don't have a properly regulated rule of law country. If we can build a rule of law country, if these companies could start behaving themselves, then everything would be, we would all make a lot more money and Russia would be a better place. And so I was actually, I had the largest investment fund in the country because most investors, when they heard my pitch, they said, well, that makes a lot of sense. We'd like to invest here in this country. We'd like it to be a better place. If you can contribute it to it being a better place and make us a lot of money, that would be a wonderful thing. Now, of course, they all abandoned me when I fell out with the regime and they started attacking me. Nobody wanted to be anywhere near me, but it was a popular and attractive pitch at the moment that I was doing it, at the moment when it was working.
At the moment when it was making money.
Well, at the moment when it was making money. Now, people don't want to. So generally, people don't want to lose money by doing well-regulated rule of law stuff. But if it's making money, then it can and potentially make an enormous amount of money. If Russia would run like a regular country, as if it was like a fair rule of law place with, everything normal, the value of the country would be 100 times greater than it is today.
Now, this country has been completely dominated by one man, and one man who now, along with your son, considers you public enemies number 1 and 2 as individuals around the world, perhaps. So, tip of the hat to you for that distinction, to you both. But tell me how you see Putin. What is his endgame? And why, for example, did he invade Ukraine? Certainly on the full-scale invasion of February 2022. Why did he do that?
Well, my analysis tends to be different than a Kremlinologist. So I think you've had Fiona Hill on your show. She's a Kremlinologist, a very smart lady, knows everything about everything when it comes to that. In my analysis, you need to be a criminologist, not a Kremlinologist, to understand Putin. Basically, Putin and every single person who serves in the Russian government does it for money. So there's not a single person that ever goes into public service to serve the public of Russia. It's one big kleptocracy, criminal machine. The guys who become traffic policemen stop you and extract bribes. The person who does the land planning won't let you get a planning approval unless you give them a bribe. The fire inspectors won't check off your fire inspection unless you give them a bribe. And it works its way up to the system, right up to Vladimir Putin. The higher you are, the more money you make. And where do the people make the money from? They make the money from theft, extortion, and just outright stealing from the state. And over a long period of time, Putin and about 1,000 people around him have stolen $1 trillion from the Russian state. That's the $1 trillion. $1,000 billion has been stolen by Putin and the 1,000 people around him from the Russian state. And the reason why people live a bad life in Russia is because that money should have been spent on schools and hospitals and roads and public services. Instead, it was spent on private jets and yachts and villas in the south of France. And that's a formula that works until it doesn't work anymore. And what I could see happening was that over time, Putin realized that he stole too much money. That someday, for reasons that he wouldn't be able to predict, something would happen and people would get really angry really quick, and they would organize very quickly, virally, and march on the Kremlin. And Putin can kill Alexei Navalny, the leader of the opposition, Boris Nemtsov, the previous leader of the opposition. He can target people and kill them or imprison people or deport people on a one-off basis. But if 1 million people march on Red Square, he's finished, and he understands that. And so he's not good at a lot of stuff, but what he is really good at is staying ahead of the curve when it comes to losing power. And by the way, he understands that if the 1 million people march on Red Square, it's not going to be an elegant exit. It will be a violent, bloody situation for him personally. So what if you do if you're a very small man? He's a tiny little man he's a very cowardly little man. you're scared to death of your own people. You're very greedy, but you're scared. And you don't know when they're going to come for you because you've stolen too much money. Well, it comes straight out of Machiavelli 101. You create a foreign enemy and you start a war. And I believe that the war in Ukraine has nothing to do with NATO enlargement, which is one of the arguments that all the political scientists make. I don't believe a word that Putin says about his imperial ambitions of restoring the greatness of Russia. If he thought Russia was going to be so great, why did he steal so much money from everybody and let them all die at such a young age because they couldn't get medical attention? I don't believe that there was any beef between the Ukrainians and the Russians. The Ukrainians are not Nazis and fascists. That was all manufactured propaganda by Putin in 2014 to create a foreign enemy and start a war. And if you have a war, then your people can't be mad at you because everyone has to be mad at the foreign enemy. And that's what he's achieved with this war. And that's the reason why this war is not going to end, why there's no peace deal to be had, because he's convinced everybody there's a foreign enemy. If there's no foreign enemy, then he's the enemy because everyone has lived a bad life under his rule. And so there's not going to be a peace deal because he can't do a peace deal. If he does a peace deal, he'll lose power. If he loses power, then he'll get strung up from a lamppost. And so, unfortunately, the only way that this thing ends is either the Russians win, in which case we're then going to be fighting with them because he needs another war with the West, or the Ukrainians win. And if they win, then Putin will end up being removed by his own people.
Isn't that pretty much the optimum outcome? I mean, what I detected in terms of analysis over the last 4 or 5 years on Ukraine, particularly from Europeans, is that they have swung from assuming that the Ukrainians were going to lose pretty much overnight to being impressed at their kind of stalwart defenses to insisting that ultimately they were going to have to sue for peace. Now there is a sense that the Ukrainians could win, and that's causing nervousness because, as you suggest, if that were to happen in a dreamland scenario, then the Russian Federation itself risks flying apart, doesn't it? I mean, the Russian Federation is an empire ruled by white men from Moscow.
I don't think the Russian Federation is going to fall apart. I think that's Putin's scare tactic with the West. He's saying if it wasn't for me, it would be a lot worse. There'd be some terrible guy. Everything would fall apart. It would be can you imagine 32 different nuclear powered sub-states? That's nonsense. That's his scare tactic. First of all, I don't think that Ukraine can win this war. I think that the best case scenario is a stalemate where Ukraine shows Russia that if you do anything more, we're going to hit you hard. We're going to punish you in ways that are going to really make you feel the pain. But that doesn't mean that they win the war. It just means that Putin isn't able to cause the damage that he used to do. You remember,
right, so as you wrote in The Independent recently, a sort of North-South Korea situation of a sort of permanent armistice without a peace deal.
And by the way, you know what happens 20 years from then? Is that Ukraine is the South Korea, the booming, democratic, vibrant economy, and Russia is the North Korea, isolated from everybody. On the satellite, you can barely see the lights, and it's a much, much, much worse situation. That's how I would imagine this thing playing itself out. And I can imagine that, and by the way, the Europeans, the Ukrainians for a while were begging to be part of NATO. I think in a few years' time, the European, in a new NATO, which doesn't include the United States, are going to be begging Ukraine to be part of their defensive situation. And I can imagine there will be some type of deal in which Ukraine says, if you help us with our reconstruction financially, we will help you with your defense militarily, because they've now become the most preeminent fighting force in our part of the world.
Yeah, it's striking, isn't it, how Trump's efforts to go after the Iranian regime, of all things, alongside Netanyahu and the Israeli right, resulted, among other things, in an increase in Ukrainian military prestige and standing, of all places, in the Gulf. I mean, we saw this a sort of understanding that kind of, oh God, who knows about this stuff? Oh, let's get the Ukrainians in. A massive change from the attitudes that prevailed a few years ago.
That's true, but I also understand that the United States spoke to its Gulf allies and told them in no uncertain terms, you can't buy any drone technology from the Ukrainians. I mean, Trump really is on Putin's side. And I have this from reliable sources that he didn't want Ukraine to get any benefit from this. He's on Putin's side. And so now, of course, their prestige has increased. And we in Europe are absolutely going to take advantage of Ukrainian technology, joint ventures with Ukrainian companies, purchases from Ukrainian companies, and also investments in Ukrainian capacity because it serves our interests and their interests perfectly. But at the end of the day, the Americans forbid that from happening, which is truly a remarkable story.
Well, give me more examples. I mean, you say that I mean, we've all seen it in terms of the rhetoric. We've seen it in terms of the fact that the United States has cut about $120 billion worth of funding, not the $300 billion that Trump claims, which is a fiction, of course. They're still providing an intelligence feed to Ukraine. And you suggested there a bit of sort of insider knowledge in terms of the attitudes that Trump is firmly on Putin's side. Can you give more examples?
Well, I mean, you don't have to have inside knowledge. You could just have So there's outside knowledge, which is U.S. has stopped funding Ukraine. U.S. is voting with North Korea, Iran, and other rogue regimes against any resolution supporting Ukraine at the United Nations. There was the shameful, unbelievable, terrible Oval Office meeting in which they publicly tried to humiliate Zelensky. There was the minerals, the shameful minerals deal, where Trump reclassified military aid as a loan to be paid back against Ukrainian rare earth minerals, which, that was the most unbelievable thing. And then, of course, there was the Anchorage understanding, or whatever you want to call it, where in some private meeting, Trump promised Putin that he would lean on Ukraine to force them to give up all the territory that Russia has been fighting since 2014 unsuccessfully to get in the Donbass. There's no inside knowledge you need. I mean, the inside knowledge that I shared is just a particular anecdote about how Trump didn't want Ukraine to get any money from the Gulf states because he's on Putin's side. But everything tells you he is. And I don't think there's any more, there's no mystery anymore to this whole thing. Even the biggest Trump apologists can't really find a way of explaining what's going on here.
How deep do you think that pro-Putin energy goes in the Trump administration?
Well, Trump controls his entire administration, all the people who work for him directly in the government of the United States. It doesn't translate at all into the Congress. So if you go to the Republican side of the aisle and you ask them who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, they will tell you Putin's the bad guy, Ukraine is the good guy, we should support Ukraine. And this comes from the most conservative Republican to the most liberal Democrat, everybody in Congress still on Ukraine's side. But you have this strange situation with Trump personally, and he controls, of course, everybody who works for him with 100% iron fist.
Do you think that that's going to have permanent long-term consequences for the United States? I mean, you suggested just earlier on that there may be a NATO without the US. There are always concerns now. I mean, it's not long into his second administration that he may pull the United States out of that alliance altogether.
Well, he's made intimations to that effect, and so has Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, or Secretary of War, as he now calls himself. They've made intimations of doing that, and so, well, the answer is to your broad question has he ruined all relations with the West, with the rest of the West? The answer is absolutely not. This is a one-man situation. If he's gone, I could easily imagine things normalizing. I can imagine that the next president, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, assuming there is a next president and they allow a peaceful transition of power, the next president will embark on a world reset to repair relations with all countries, to promise predictable trade links, to shore up military alliances that were frayed. And I think everyone would welcome that with open arms in the West. Now people will all, continue to develop weapon systems that are not dependent on the United States, and they'll continue to develop artificial intelligence that doesn't rely on U.S. computers and so on and so forth, and satellites don't rely on U.S. satellites, because nobody wants to be dependent on a fickle ally. But I think for the most part, American people are good people. The American public has a good approach to Ukraine and Russia, has a good approach to most of these issues. It's just one man, and for reasons that are very much questionable why he's doing this.
Do you think that there could be a situation in which there isn't a peaceful transition of power? Do you think the midterms could be a significant physical flashpoint, for example?
Well, look at what happened in January 6, 2020. He tried to, using tools, prevent a peaceful transition of power. It didn't work. He's a lot more powerful now. Why would he do it? Why would he be so amenable to a peaceful transition of power in 2028 if he wasn't in 2020? And what will happen just with the midterms if the Democrats win both houses of Congress? There'll be investigations, there'll be subpoenas. Every single one of these questionable business deals that he's done will be looked into in great detail. It'll be a nightmare for him. So what will his incentives be to prevent that from happening? Will he get away with it? Who knows? But that's what he will want for sure.
And so what is your prediction for the midterms? Is there going to be violence?
I don't really have a prediction for the midterms. I don't know. My general sense is that the institutions in the United States have functioned. The courts continue to rule against bad decisions of the administration. The media continues to report on the corruption of the U.S. Trump administration. The people continue to stand up. Look at what happened in Minnesota. They ran those guys out. And so I don't think that the institutions are all going to collapse, but I think it's going to be a fight. I think that the people who believe in clean, non-kleptocracy democracy are going to have a big fight on their hands. And this is not a partisan thing. It's not Democrats versus Republicans. It's the people of America versus kleptocracy.
Could you ever have imagined, I mean, what you're describing Trump's agenda to be sounds like Putin. Could you ever have imagined that you'd be describing the American president in those sort of terms only 5 or 6 years ago?
It was unimaginable. I could have never. America was the North Star. It was the country that everybody looked to stand up to corruption, to stand up to dictators, authoritarians, to fight for democracy, to fight for the little guy, and all that's been thrown out the window.
I always like to conclude these World of Trouble podcasts with as an American, you probably never heard of Ian Dury, but when I was an undergraduate, he was very much our musical hero. And he has a song called Reasons to Be Cheerful. Can you give us some? Any?
Yeah, of course. I think that the Ukrainians are showing that you don't need to be a superpower to fight against a superpower. The people of America, the institutions, the judges are ruling against all bad decisions. Every day I see things happening that gives me reason to be optimistic. And in a certain way, the worse it gets in America, the more likely it is that this terrible fever will break. Because at the end of the day, most people don't. Why would it be in anyone's interest to have a small group of people doing all this stuff at the expense of everybody else? It's not.
Bill Browder, thank you so much for your time and your insights. And I really hope you'll come back and join us again, perhaps when there's either a frozen front line in Ukraine or once he's collapsed, the government has collapsed altogether. In the Kremlin, that is.
Let's hope so.
Thank you. Thank you so much.